What did the first humans think when the world began to harden around them? When rivers narrowed into glass? When familiar paths vanished beneath a white silence no story had prepared them for? History preserves the cold in fragments of stone, in trapped air, in bones laid down under ancient skies. But the inward experience of those first witnesses remains strangely dim, as if the most important part of the memory was never written anywhere at all. Therefore, before the body sinks fully into this comfort, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this quiet work truly speaks to you. And if it does, share your location and local time below, so this small circle of listeners can gather, briefly, across the dark. There is something unsettling about the way the Ice Age is usually remembered. It is spoken of as though it belonged only to glaciers, mammoths, and maps in textbooks, as though it were a chapter in the life of the planet rather than a pressure placed directly upon human skin. The words themselves sound distant. Ice Age. They arrive polished, scientific, almost calm. Yet for the people who walked into that changing world, there could have been nothing abstract about it. The cold was not a concept. It was breath turning visible in the air. It was hunger moving faster across the land than rumour. It was the silence of animals leaving one valley and not returning to the next. It was the strange realization that the world could change without asking permission, and keep changing long after fear had become normal. The Earth had already known deep cold before human beings appeared. Long before memory, before language as it is now imagined, before any fire was carried carefully through a storm by hands that could tremble, the climate had risen and fallen in great cycles. Ice advanced, retreated, returned. But at some point, a creature emerged that could notice the pattern only dimly, could suffer within it fully, and could wonder, perhaps for the first time, whether the world itself had turned against them. That may be one of the oldest human questions ever formed, though no one can prove it was spoken. Not in exactly those words, perhaps not in words at all, perhaps only in a stare held too long toward a horizon growing pale and cruel. This is where the record becomes both generous and evasive. There is evidence everywhere and certainty almost nowhere. Ice cores taken from Greenland and Antarctica hold ancient atmospheres like sealed confessions. Sediment layers preserve shifts in dust, ash, and pollen. Bones of animals tell their own story of movement, stress, and extinction. Human remains, sparse and fragile, appear in caves and shelters as though rising from a dream. Stone tools remain where hands once set them down. Hearths, pigments, cut marks, beads, broken points, footprints hardened in mud, and then abandoned to ages of darkness. All of it is real. All of it matters. And yet none of it says plainly what it felt like to stand inside a season that had begun to lengthen into centuries. So history reconstructs what it can. It speaks of glacial periods and interglacial intervals. It names marine isotope stages. It calculates temperature drops, tracks migration routes, studies shifting vegetation and the expansion of steppe tundra. This knowledge is precise, powerful, earned through generations of patient study. But knowledge, even when careful, sometimes creates an illusion of completeness. The map begins to feel like the journey. The date begins to feel like the event. A graph becomes a substitute for dread. And somewhere beneath those elegant reconstructions, the first human experience of overwhelming climate remains strangely ungrasped, almost hidden inside the science that reveals it. Perhaps that is inevitable. The first humans who endured severe glacial conditions left no chronicles, no carved testimony explaining what they thought was happening. There are no winter diaries from the Upper Paleolithic, no preserved speech from a mother watching game disappear beyond the reach of her group, no record from an elder trying to explain why a river froze where his own ancestors claimed it once flowed freely. Instead, there are only traces, and traces have a way of inviting both humility and temptation. Humility because they remind the modern mind how little it truly knows. Temptation because silence makes room for theories, and where silence opens, stories gather. Some of those stories are careful and grounded. They imagine human bands adapting slowly, learning to stitch hides tighter, to tend fire more efficiently, to cooperate more closely under pressure. They see intelligence deepening through hardship, not as a miracle, but as a necessity. In this view, the Ice Age was not a single catastrophe, but a long education in endurance. It made social bonds more vital, memory more useful, planning more urgent. It may even have sharpened symbolic thought. A world that could shift so radically may have forced human beings to imagine what was absent, to fear what had not yet arrived, to prepare for what could not be seen. Cold, in that sense, may have shaped consciousness itself. Other possibilities drift at the edge of more controversial thought. Not fantasy, not invention, but questions that have never entirely gone away. How much evidence was lost because the most habitable Ice Age landscapes were later drowned when sea levels rose? How many campsites, ritual grounds, migration corridors and burial places vanished under post-glacial waters before anyone could know they existed? If early humans lived heavily along coasts, river valleys and exposed continental shelves, then the archive of their lives may now lie far from shore, beneath layers of mud and dark water. What is called prehistory may, in part, be a history physically removed from reach. That thought changes the mood of the entire subject. It suggests not merely that the past is old, but that it may have been deliberately obscured by the mechanics of the planet itself, not by a human censor, at least not at first, but by melting ice, swelling seas, and the patient burial power of time. The Earth has a way of editing. It does not erase everything. It leaves enough to provoke the search, enough to imply a fuller world once stood behind the surviving fragments. But it withholds enough to keep certainty thin, and once that possibility enters the mind, another follows quietly behind it. If the surviving record is incomplete, then the modern story of the first Ice Age humans may also be incomplete in ways more profound than usually admitted. Perhaps whole chapters are missing. Perhaps the first people to experience harsh glacial reality were not merely wandering survivors at the edge of cognition, but acute observers of change, makers of meaning, readers of landscape, keepers of subtle knowledge that left only indirect marks. Perhaps they understood patterns in sky, heard movement and frozen water with an intimacy the modern world can barely imagine. Or perhaps the truth is more unsettling still. Perhaps they understood enough to know they were living through an ending, but not enough to stop it. There is a reason the imagination returns so often to caves when thinking about this period. Caves feel like memory chambers, natural vaults where the earth kept a few relics and refused the rest. A handprint on stone can disturb more deeply than a monument. It is not grand. It does not explain itself. It only announces that someone was there. Someone with warmth in the palm, pulse in the wrist, breath in the chest. Someone who touched the wall while the world outside may already have been changing beyond recognition. That is the nearness that makes the Ice Age uncanny. It is both unimaginably far and physically intimate. It can still be touched. Yet even touch can mislead. The modern mind often imagines early humans as crude simply because they were early, as if chronology itself were a measure of awareness. But harsh environments do not usually spare the dull. They demand reading, inference, adaptation. To survive recurring cold, one had to notice more than the comfortable mind notices. Snow texture, animal tracks, wind shifts, star positions, edible roots under frozen ground, shelter angles, the habits of fire in enclosed spaces, the behaviour of prey before weather turned. This was not ignorance wandering through whiteness. It was perception under pressure, a kind of intelligence sharpened against disappearance. And still, with all this, the central mystery remains. When did cold become history for them? When did it stop being weather and become a world? There must have been a threshold, though it left no single sign. A winter harsher than those remembered by the oldest living member of a group. A migration route that failed. A hunting ground that emptied. A frozen season that lingered too long and returned too soon. Perhaps the first humans who experienced what is now called the Ice Age did not know they were entering an epoch. Perhaps they believed the land itself had become unreliable or sacred or wounded or hostile or all of these at once. Later ages would create myths of flood, fire, darkness, and worlds remade. Later civilizations would speak in symbols about lost ages and broken orders. It is tempting to look backward and connect those stories too neatly to glacial memory. The honest mind resists easy lines, and yet the temptation remains because the human response to overwhelming change does not vanish. It changes costume. It becomes religion, legend, ritual, philosophy, apocalypse. The first Ice Age humans may have had none of those in forms familiar now, but perhaps they possessed their own versions. Gestures, stories, marks, prohibitions, silences. Ways of containing what could not be controlled. There is, beneath all this, an almost unbearable irony. The first humans to live through great cold may have experienced one of the most defining transformations in human existence. And yet their account of it is the one account no one can recover directly. They were there at the edge of climatic terror, at the threshold where human adaptability and human uncertainty met each other in the dark, and what survives of them is mostly what the cold failed to destroy. A shaped stone, a fragment of bone, a smudge of ochre. The rest remains locked in absence. Perhaps that is why the subject refuses to settle. It is not merely about the past. It is about the limits of what can be known when the witnesses are gone, and the world itself has tampered with the archive. The Ice Age in this sense is not only a period of cold, it is an early lesson in historical blindness, a reminder that what happened to human beings is often larger than what history is able to keep. And if that is true, then a more difficult question begins to rise through the snow. If the first humans experienced the coming of overwhelming cold as a rupture in reality, as a breaking of continuity, as the start of a long conversation between fear and survival, then what else might have been broken at the same time? What knowledge, what roots, what early forms of memory were buried so deeply that the modern world mistakes their disappearance for proof they never existed at all? Cold does not arrive all at once, at least not in the way memory prefers to imagine it. It gathers, it tests edges first. It lingers a little longer in shaded valleys, bites a little harder at dawn, delays the thaw by a few uncertain days, then a few more. A lake that once broke open under the first patient light of spring begins to hold its skin of ice deeper into the season. Herds alter their routes by degrees too small to alarm anyone at first. The wind develops a different discipline, and somewhere within that slow rearrangement, human beings are asked to notice what even the land itself does not yet seem ready to confess. The ancient climate record suggests that the world of the Pleistocene was not a single, uninterrupted prison of snow, but a restless sequence of advances and withdrawals, pulses of severe cold, softer intervals and abrupt reversals. Ice expanded across vast northern territories, but beyond the great ice sheets there stretched immense cold grasslands, steppe tundra plains, open country shaped by frost, drought, and relentless seasonality. It was not simply a white world, it was a hard world, dry in places, windy in others, beautiful in the distant and merciless way of landscapes that make no promise to the creatures moving across them. Human beings did not stand apart from that transformation. They were folded into it, pressed by it, instructed by it, and perhaps, in time, inwardly changed by it. One of the quiet distortions of later thought is the assumption that climate is background and humanity is foreground, as if weather were scenery and the human story something played out in front of it. But for the first people living under glacial conditions, climate was not backdrop. It was the nearest power. It decided where water could be found, where trees still stood, where animals gathered, where shelter could last. where children might survive another winter. It could erase familiarity without violence in the ordinary sense. A valley could remain in place and still become another world. The hills did not need to move for life to become unrecognizable. The terms of existence could shift while every stone remained where it had always been. That may be why the human experience of the Ice Age is so difficult to recover. Modern descriptions naturally favour the visible drama of ice sheets and extinct animals, but what shaped daily consciousness may have been something slower and more intimate. Repeated adjustment. A group moves camp because the winds have changed. Fuel becomes harder to gather. Hides must be cured more carefully. Snow cover alters the behaviour of prey. Familiar routes become dangerous in darkness that seems to last longer than memory says it should. Infants must be watched more closely. Elders no longer predict the season as accurately as they once did. At what point does adaptation become a kind of grief, even if no one yet has a word for it? The archaeological record sometimes hints at this pressure without ever naming it. Sites appear and vanish in patterns tied to habitability. Tool traditions shift across regions. Settlement choices reflect changing ecologies. Fire becomes central not only as warmth, but as a boundary between the human body and the indifference outside it. There is something almost sacred in that recurring image, a small circle of light, breath, skin, hide, smoke, and whispered coordination held against a darkness ruled by frost. It is easy to romanticize such scenes from the safety of distance. More difficult is to admit what they may have contained. Fatigue, hunger, quarrels, fear, calculation, and the dawning awareness that nature was not stable enough to trust. This is where the older assumption of primitive man begins to feel especially inadequate. The people who endured the severe rhythms of the late Pleistocene were not simple, because they lacked writing. They may have been among the most attentive humans who ever lived. Their survival depended on pattern recognition refined to a degree that settled agricultural life, later redistributed into different forms. Snow texture could signal danger. Hoof marks in frozen ground could decide the movement of a group. A subtle shift in bird behaviour might hint at water or weather. The sky itself was not merely overhead decoration, it was information. And information, in a cold world, was the difference between passing through a season and being consumed by it. Yet there is another layer to this question, one more difficult to measure. What did prolonged cold do not only to movement and diet, but to imagination? If the earth repeatedly changed its face, if abundance could narrow into scarcity without moral explanation, if an entire generation could inherit conditions harsher than those remembered by their elders, then the mind would have been forced into a deeper relationship with uncertainty. It is possible that what later became ritual, taboo, seasonal observance, or cosmological storytelling first took shape under precisely such pressure, not because Ice Age people were superstitious in a simplistic sense, but because human beings seek meaning where control fails. The notion is not without supporting echoes. Scholars have long debated whether recurring environmental instability encouraged more complex social cooperation, symbolic communication, and long-term planning. There is no universal agreement on how direct that relationship was, but the question lingers because it feels difficult to dismiss. Hardship alone does not guarantee wisdom, yet a world that punishes inattention may encourage memory to become more deliberate, transmission more careful, and collective behaviour more structured. A severe climate may not invent culture, but it may give culture sharper teeth. If that is so, the Ice Age was not merely something humans survived. It may have been one of the great unseen sculptors of the human interior. Under recurrent cold, time itself changes shape. Warm season abundance is no longer enough. One must think ahead, preserve, anticipate, rehearse. The future presses on the present more heavily. A missed opportunity does not remain a small mistake. It expands into risk. Under such conditions, thought grows longer. Social trust grows more necessary. Conflict grows more dangerous. Memory grows more valuable. Even tenderness may change, because care in severe climates becomes inseparable from technique. To keep another person alive is not only to love them, but to know how. And still, within this slow, harsh schooling, the land remained unstable in another sense. The glacial world was not static. Ice advanced and retreated, wetlands expanded and vanished, rivers changed their course, dust blew across open plains, coasts shifted with sea level, great corridors opened for a time and then closed again. Humans were living not just in a cold world, but in a moving one. This may be the detail most likely to disturb the modern imagination. Stability was not the default condition temporarily broken by disaster. Instability may have been the condition itself. A lifetime of adjustment was not an interruption. It was normality. Such a world would not only test bodies, it would alter trust in the continuity of place. The modern mind often grounds identity in maps, borders, named settlements, inherited architecture. Ice Age identity may have been tied more heavily to movement, route knowledge, recurring landmarks, animal cycles, and remembered safe zones that could not always be relied upon. When the environment itself behaves like a shifting threshold, permanence becomes difficult to imagine. One belongs not to a fixed landscape, perhaps, but to a sequence of returns that may fail. And if returns begin to fail, something darker enters the human relationship with nature. Not hatred, not exactly, but suspicion. A sense that the world contains intentions it does not explain. One can picture a hunting band arriving too late to a place that should have held life, and finding instead only wind over crusted ground. One can imagine the silence that follows such moments. No great speech, no philosophy. No, only a deeper listening, as if the land itself were withholding an answer. It is in that silence that the first real divide may have appeared, the moment when climate ceased to be merely endured and began to be interpreted. Once interpretation begins, history deepens. A frozen season is never only cold again. It becomes a sign, a warning, a memory, a comparison. And the first humans, watching these changes gather and repeat, may have begun to suspect that the Earth was keeping time in a language far older than their own. If they learned to read even fragments of it, then perhaps the earlier seeds of ritual and symbolic thought did not emerge in comfort, but under skies that made every prediction feel fragile. The next question, then, is not only how they moved through such a world, but how they tried to speak back to it when speech itself was still learning how to remember. When a human hand appears on stone after tens of thousands of years, it does not feel like evidence in the ordinary sense. It feels closer to an interruption, a pause in the long silence of prehistory, a shape pressed into mineral darkness by someone who had weight, warmth, and a pulse. Someone who stood inside a cave while the outer world remained uncertain, cold, and immense. The hand says almost nothing, and yet it says too much. It makes the distance unbearable. Suddenly the Ice Age is no longer an abstract theatre of glaciers and migrating herds. It becomes a chamber where one person stood still long enough to leave a trace, as if to resist being erased. This is where the story begins to move inward. The cold world outside, with all its pressures, migrations and hungers, does not fully explain what happened within the human mind. Something changed there too, or at least became visible there in a new way, in caves and rock shelters scattered across Europe and beyond, in places like Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, El Castillo, and other less famous chambers half buried in geological time. Ice Age people left images that have unsettled every later age that has found them. Horses surge along curved walls, bison appear in layered motion, mammoths, lions, rhinoceroses, stags, handprints, dots, signs, and abstract marks emerge where no sunlight would have guided the work. These images do not feel casual. They feel deliberate, concealed, and strangely composed, as if they belong to an interior life deeper than mere decoration. For a long time, Modern interpretations tried to make these images obedient to simpler explanations: hunting magic, primitive art, totemic markings, educational scenes. None of these possibilities is entirely foolish, and some may hold part of the truth, yet none of them has fully quieted the strange gravity of cave art. The animals are too alive, the placement too considered, the darkness too meaningful. Some chambers are difficult to reach, requiring movement through narrow passages or deep shadow. A few images seem positioned to use the natural contours of stone, allowing the wall itself to become muscle, shoulder, flank, or movement. Firelight would have made them tremble. To stand there was not only to see, it was to enter a space where perception itself was being shaped. And perhaps that is the point. The first humans to endure glacial worlds may not simply have responded to cold with better tools and stronger shelters. They may also have retreated inward, creating symbolic spaces where the chaos outside could be held, transformed, or spoken to indirectly. If the open landscape was unstable, the cave offered another kind of order: darkness, enclosure, resonance, and ritual possibility. The body enters, the light changes, the wall receives an image, a gesture becomes memory, a chamber becomes more than shelter, it becomes a threshold. This has led some researchers to ask whether cave art belonged not to ordinary daily life, but to altered states of consciousness, initiation rites, or early cosmological thought. Such ideas remain debated, but they do not arise from nowhere. The deep cave is a peculiar setting for casual illustration. Acoustics in certain painted chambers seem unusually resonant. Some scholars have suggested that rhythmic sound, chant, or percussion may have played a role in these spaces. Others have explored whether some abstract patterns resemble entoptic forms, the geometric shapes sometimes perceived in altered neurological states. These theories are cautious where they are strongest and speculative where they are weakest, but together they suggest something important. Ice Age imagery may not have been simply representational, it may have been experiential. And experience, especially under pressure, often seeks form. A world of shifting climate, dangerous animals, vanishing routes, and uncertain seasons would not only sharpen observation, it might also intensify the need to locate hidden structure inside disorder. The painted bison may have been an animal, yes, but also a concentration of memory, danger, dependence, reverence, and repetition. To paint such a creature was perhaps not merely to depict it, but to place it inside a system of attention. The wall held what the open world would not hold still. There is a quiet temptation here to romanticize Ice Age people as mystics of perfect unity with nature. The truth was almost certainly harsher and more complicated. Reverence and fear often lived together. The animal painted with breathtaking care may have been hunted, tracked, wounded, butchered, eaten, feared, admired, and dreamed about all at once. Human beings have rarely separated beauty from necessity as cleanly as later philosophy pretends. The cave image may have carried several meanings at once, none cancelling the others. It could be practical and sacred, immediate and mythic. A survival relationship deep enough eventually becomes symbolic whether anyone plans it or not. Then there are the hand stencils, among the most haunting traces of all. They do not display mastery in the same way the painted animals do. They are simpler, almost abrupt, a palm against stone, pigment blown around it, the body withdrawn, leaving its outline, presence through absence. One does not need to impose modern psychology onto them to feel the intensity of that act. A handprint is a claim, but also a surrender. It says someone was here. It also says someone is no longer here. In that sense, it may be one of the earliest human negotiations with mortality ever preserved. Not a written philosophy of death, but a gesture that acknowledges vanishing by refusing to vanish completely. The timing matters too. Much of the great cave art belongs to the Upper Paleolithic, during phases of the last glacial period when humans were living under demanding environmental conditions. This does not mean cold-produced art in any simple mechanical way. but it is difficult to ignore the coincidence between ecological stress, expanding symbolic culture, and the emergence of increasingly sophisticated visual expression. Perhaps when the outer world becomes less predictable, inner worlds become more structured. Perhaps image-making deepens not in spite of instability, but partly because of it. Yet even here, loss persists. What survives on cave walls is only a fraction of what once existed. There would have been stories carried in voice alone, body markings, wood carvings, textiles, songs, dances, ephemeral rituals performed under open sky, and all the perishable materials the earth rarely preserves. The caves feel central now because stone kept them. But preservation is not the same as importance. The modern view may be tilted toward what the geology happened to spare. Entire symbolic systems may have flourished in snowfields, campsites, coasts and forests, now vanished without residue. The visible archive may be less a complete picture than a strange and accidental selection. That awareness changes how the painted chambers are understood. They are not necessarily the whole spiritual life of Ice Age humanity. They may be only the densest surviving knots in a much larger web of meaning. If so, then the silence around them becomes even heavier. The hand on the wall belongs to a missing language. The bison belongs to a missing world. The cave itself, once alive with firelight, footsteps, breath, and perhaps song, now stands empty except for its own echo and the interpretations modern people carry into it. An interpretation can become its own kind of veil. Some scholars see hunting rites. Others see mythology. Others see shamanic trance, early astronomy, structured teaching, social memory, or symbolic play. It is possible that several of these are true at once, depending on the place, the people, and the century. The urge to find one answer may say more about the modern mind than about the Ice Age one. Perhaps the deeper lesson is that the first humans who experienced severe glacial worlds were already capable of living inside layered meanings that resist reduction. They were not waiting for civilization to become human. They were already making worlds within the world. If that is true, then the cave is more than refuge. It is evidence that early humans did not simply endure the Ice Age from the outside. They entered it imaginatively. They carried animals, fears, patterns, and perhaps even cosmologies into darkness, and placed them on stone in forms that outlived their own names. The question that remains is not only what those images meant, but what they were trying to preserve against erasure. For if the wall became a memory surface, then perhaps something in the open world had already begun to disappear too quickly to trust. What disappears first when a world begins to change beyond recognition is not always life. Sometimes it is orientation. A path still exists, but no longer leads where it once led. A ridge remains visible, but the animals that gave it meaning have altered their route. The river is still there, but not in the season it used to be trusted. In a glacial world, the geography that mattered most to human beings may not have been mountains and valleys alone, but movement itself, the invisible lines of return, the remembered passages between water, shelter, prey, and safety. Once those lines began to fray, the earth did not need to collapse to become unfamiliar. It only needed to stop keeping its old promises. This is where the human story of the Ice Age begins to stretch outward across great distances. The first people who lived under severe glacial conditions were not fixed in place, held neatly inside borders the modern mind can label on a map. They moved through shifting ecologies, along corridors that opened and closed with cold, across plains that no longer exist, beside coastlines now drowned, through territories where the difference between survival and disappearance might depend on knowledge that could not be written down. Migration in such a world was not simply relocation, it was memory in motion. The land itself encouraged this mobility, though not always by choice. During colder phases of the Pleistocene, vast quantities of water were locked in ice sheets, and sea levels dropped dramatically. Continental shelves emerged. River valleys extended farther outward. Coasts lay where waves no longer reach. Regions now separated by water were at certain times linked by exposed land. What later ages would call the Bering Land Bridge is only the most familiar example, but it was part of a broader truth. The glacial world repeatedly rearranged the planet's thresholds. Paths existed, then vanished. Habitable zones shifted. What seems impossible on a modern globe may once have been an open horizon under a colder sky, and yet the phrase land bridge can be misleading in its neatness. It sounds stable, almost engineered, as though nature laid down a simple crossing for human use. The reality was likely harsher, a broad, dry, windy region of steppe-like terrain, difficult, exposed, and governed by ecological opportunity as much as geography. Human groups did not move because a line on a future map invited them. They moved because herds moved, because climates pressed, because familiar grounds became less dependable, because life itself required motion. The route may only become visible in hindsight. To those walking it, there may have been no sense of entering history, only the exhausted necessity of following what remained possible. This gives migration a different emotional weight. It is often described triumphantly as expansion, resilience, boldness, the great dispersal of the species, and perhaps it was all of those. But somewhere beneath that language lies another mood, reluctance. A people does not always leave because it desires the unknown. Sometimes it leaves because the known has started to fail. There is a quiet grief in that possibility. The first humans who moved through glacial corridors may not have felt like explorers. They may have felt like witnesses to a retreating world. One of the most haunting features of this story is how much of it may now be physically inaccessible. If humans followed coasts during periods of lower sea level, then some of the most vital migration routes of the late Pleistocene may now lie beneath the ocean. Campsites, tool-making areas, shell middens, burial grounds, and seasonal stopping points could have been submerged as ice melted and sea levels rose. This is not a fringe thought. It is a sober archaeological problem. The map of surviving sites may be distorted precisely because the most attractive landscapes for human occupation, coasts, estuaries, river mouths, fertile lowlands, were among the first to disappear under post-glacial waters. The modern archive may be partial not through neglect alone, but through inundation. That possibility changes the tone of everything. It means the apparent thinness of early human presence in some regions may not reflect absence, but loss of access. Whole stretches of the story may be waiting in sediments offshore, hidden beneath silt, darkness, and technological difficulty. The first Ice Age humans may have known shorelines that later civilizations never even suspected had existed. They may have stood on land now crossed by fishing boats and satellite signals, their fires long buried beneath marine deposits, their names unrecorded not because they lacked significance, but because the sea kept advancing after they were gone. It is tempting, then, to imagine migration as a sequence of heroic arrivals, but it may have felt more like continual recalibration. One season opens a passage, another closes it. A valley that once held game becomes unreliable. An exposed plain offers new opportunities but little shelter. A coastline feeds a group for generations, then slowly retreats from memory as the waters rise. Children grow up hearing of places elders once knew but can no longer reach. Stories become geographic after images. Directions survive longer than destinations. In this sense, migration is not only about movement through space, it is also about living through the slow death of known places. The archaeological traces support at least part of this melancholy picture. Human dispersal into Eurasia, the occupation of difficult northern latitudes, and the eventual peopling of the Americas all unfolded against dynamic climatic backdrops. There were windows of access, ecological bottlenecks, episodes of isolation, and stretches of adaptation so severe that each successful movement must have depended on knowledge carried carefully from one generation to the next. But what kind of knowledge was that? Not only how to shape a blade or prepare a hide, it must also have included where wind broke differently, which valley held late-season water, how certain stars aligned with return routes, which animals could be followed safely, which landscapes invited death by appearing generous too soon. There is something almost sacred in the image of such knowledge passing without script, a direction spoken in darkness. A caution repeated over fire, a remembered crossing tied to a season and a constellation. In modern thought, civilization is often imagined as beginning with cities, monuments, and stored grain. But perhaps one of its oldest forms was simply this: the disciplined transmission of survival pathways through unstable land. To know the route was not an incidental skill, it was inheritance. It was law before law had writing. It was continuity kept alive in moving bodies. And yet continuity in the Ice Age was never secure. Human groups didn't only migrate through wilderness. They may also have encountered other human populations, including Neanderthals, and perhaps other now vanished branches of humanity in different regions and times. That makes the landscape even stranger. It was not empty. It was peopled in ways the modern world has only begun to recover through fossils, tools, and genetic evidence. A valley entered by one band may already have had a history in the memory of another. A shelter might carry traces of those who no longer remained. The first glacial migrations were not merely journeys into land. They were passages through layers of vanished human presence, and if those layers were repeatedly broken by climate, drowned by sea rise or buried under later sediments, then the modern story may still be reading only the edges of a much deeper record. The routes remembered by archaeology are those fortunate enough to leave signals on durable ground. But what of the others? What of the coastal ways now lost beneath water, the temporary camps on exposed shelves, the crossings that mattered for only a few generations before being erased by flood and thaw? The planet has preserved just enough to suggest a fuller human map once existed, and withheld enough to keep that map permanently incomplete. Perhaps this is why migration during the Ice Age feels less like a solved chapter than a dimly lit passage. The footprints are there, but not all of them. The roads existed, but many have been removed. The people moved, adapted, reached new worlds, and carried memory across distances so vast that it still unsettles the mind. But each recovered route also points toward a quieter truth, that some of the most important journeys in human history may now lie beneath the sea, beyond easy recovery, leaving behind only one disturbing question. If entire landscapes of movement have vanished, then how much of early humanity's real story was not forgotten by people at all, but taken away by the earth itself before history had the chance to begin? Long before human beings learned to imagine themselves as masters of the world, they lived inside a different arrangement of power. In that old order, the human body was not the unquestioned centre of the landscape. It was vulnerable flesh moving among other hungers. It slept lightly. It listened before it stepped. It measured darkness not by romance, but by what might already be breathing within it. The Ice Age was not only a contest with cold, it was also a season of proximity to creatures whose size, speed, and force could make a human life feel alarmingly brief. And perhaps that nearness to powerful animals did more than threaten survival. Perhaps it altered the texture of thought itself. The glacial world was thick with presences now gone or transformed beyond recognition. Woolly mammoths moved across open plains like slow weather made visible, carrying with them not only meat and bone and ivory, but a kind of immense gravity. Steppe bison, giant deer, wild horses, reindeer, woolly rhinoceroses, musk oxen, cave bears, cave lions, hyenas, wolves. These were not decorative additions to the landscape. They were among its ruling facts. Human beings survived by reading them, avoiding them, following them, killing some of them, and perhaps learning from all of them. To wake in such a world was to enter at once into a relationship with beings larger, older, and in some cases better fitted to the cold than any human body could ever be. This changes the emotional atmosphere of the Ice Age in ways modern reconstructions often soften. It is easy now to look at illustrations of mammoths in museum halls and feel curiosity, even affection, because extinction has made them safe. But safety is a gift the first humans never had. A mammoth herd was not only majestic, it was dangerous, unpredictable, capable of violence, yet also potentially the source of warmth, tools, food, shelter materials, and social survival for a group willing to risk the encounter. The same creature could be necessity and terror in one body. That doubleness matters. The animal world of the Ice Age was not neatly divided into fear and usefulness. It lived in a more disturbing union of both. One begins to sense, then, why animals dominate the surviving imagery of so many Paleolithic caves. It is not merely that animals were hunted, nor simply that they were admired. They occupied the outer boundaries of human dependence and human anxiety. Their movements could decide whether a season ended in abundance or famine. Their tracks could mean hope. Their absence could mean slow disaster. Their attack could shatter a camp in moments. And because they were seen so intensely, repeatedly, and under conditions of real consequence, they likely entered the human imagination with a force difficult for the modern world to recover. An animal was never just an animal when so much of existence bent around it. There is a temptation in later thought to imagine that reverence for animals belongs to a softer, more spiritualized vision of the prehistoric past. Yet reverence is often born not from comfort, but from exposure. Human beings tend to sacralize what they cannot fully control and cannot survive without. In that sense, the great creatures of the Ice Age may have occupied a threshold zone between ecology and myth, long before myth took forms that can be recognized in writing. A lion seen in darkness, a herd crossing frozen ground, a bear emerging from its den after winter. These were not mere sightings. They were encounters with concentrated power. To live near such beings was to inhabit a world where symbolism did not need to be invented. It rose naturally from danger. The predators especially must have shaped human consciousness in deep and difficult ways. Cave lions, larger than many lions today, and lacking the familiar mane that later imagery would attach to kingship, moved through the same territories as humans. Cave hyenas competed for carcasses and space. Wolves trailed movement through snow. Cave bears occupied shelters that humans may also have wanted to use. Every cave entrance, every carcass, every stretch of quiet dark may have held uncertainty. The human mind under such conditions would not become abstractly philosophical first. It would become watchful. Attention was not merely a skill, it was protection against surprise. The world could strike with muscle and teeth before it could be understood, and yet watchfulness may itself have become one of the roots of symbolic life. To track an animal is already to think in absence. One sees what is no longer present and infers what remains ahead. One studies broken snow, pressed grass, disturbed mud, bent twigs, scent, scat, silence. A missing body becomes legible through signs. This is practical intelligence, but it is not far from something larger. It requires imagination disciplined by evidence. The hunter must picture what cannot yet be seen. Perhaps the same faculty that later allowed humans to build myths, stories, and cosmologies was sharpened first in snow by the necessity of reading the invisible through traces. That idea grows darker when one remembers that human beings were themselves trace makers for other creatures. Their scent carried, their footprints spoke, their camps emitted warmth and refuse. The same interpretive world humans apply to animals could be turned back upon them by predators. They were readers, but also readable. For all the ingenuity of tools and fire, the Ice Age human remained physically fragile in comparison with the massive life surrounding them. This may be one of the most humbling truths buried beneath later fantasies of human supremacy. The first great stage of human endurance unfolded not in domination, but in negotiated vulnerability. Perhaps that is why the bond between humans and animals during the Ice Age feels so charged even now. It was not sentimental. It was intimate because it had to be. A reindeer migration might structure the movement of an entire community. The behaviour of horse herds could determine travel. The seasonal patterns of mammoths might shape risk and reward on a scale large enough to affect generations. Animal bodies became part of human architecture as well. Hides became clothing and shelter. Bones became tools and frames. Sinew became thread. Fat became light and heat. In a severe climate, to survive among animals often meant, in the most literal sense, to survive through them. This intimacy has led some scholars to wonder whether many early rituals or symbolic systems were built around animal knowledge far more deeply than later agricultural societies could remember. Not in a naive sense of animal worship, but in a recognition that identity itself may once have formed around recurring relationships with certain species. A people might understand time through migration, danger through predator behavior, endurance through prey scarcity, and even landscape through the habits of herds. In such a world, human self-understanding would never be entirely separate from animal life. To know who one was may have required knowing what moved nearby in darkness, what returned in spring, what vanished when cold deepened, what could kill, and what could keep a family alive. There is another sadness here too, one that only becomes visible from the far side of extinction. Many of those great creatures disappeared by the end of the Pleistocene or changed their ranges profoundly. The causes remain debated and vary by region: climate shifts, human hunting pressures, ecological instability, combinations of all three. But whatever the exact mechanism, the world of the first Ice Age humans eventually thinned. Beings once central to existence passed into bone, image, and speculation. This means that some of the oldest human emotions may have formed in relation to animals no human being can now encounter alive. Fear, awe, gratitude, ritual attention, hunting intelligence. All these may have once been calibrated to creatures the modern world knows only through remains and art. So when a mammoth appears on a cave wall, or a lion in ancient pigment turns its head across stone, the image may be carrying more than beauty and skill. It may be preserving a relationship that later humanity could not afford to lose entirely, even as the living animal itself disappeared. The wall remembers what the grasslands no longer can. It holds the outline of a world in which humans were not alone, not central, and not secure. A world in which survival required entering into tense, repeated conversation with beings whose presence filled both the horizon and the mind. And once that conversation began, another question could no longer be avoided. If animals shaped how the first Ice Age humans moved, feared, hunted, and imagined, then what happened when some of those creatures began to vanish too, when even the great powers of the cold were no longer reliable signs that the world would remain what it had been? There is a quiet unease in the realization that the first humans who endured the Ice Age were not alone in being human. The cold world was not occupied by a single lineage moving heroically across empty land toward destiny. It was more crowded than that, more intimate and perhaps more tragic. Beneath the same winter sky, beside the same rivers rimmed with ice, near the same herds and caves and sheltered valleys, other humans lived as well. They shaped tools, buried their dead, watched the weather turn, and disappeared. The modern imagination often treats this knowledge as a scientific curiosity, a corrected footnote to older ideas of human uniqueness. But it feels heavier than that. It means the glacial world was inhabited not only by ancestors, but by relatives lost closely enough that fragments of them still remain inside living bodies. For much of modern history, Neanderthals were made to carry a humiliating role in the story of humanity. They were cast as crude foils, evolutionary failures, heavy-browed shadows waiting to be replaced by something more worthy. It was a comforting narrative, perhaps, because it made the rise of modern humans appear clean and inevitable. But the evidence has resisted that simplicity. Neanderthals made complex tools, controlled fire, hunted large animals, survived in severe environments for immense spans of time, and almost certainly possessed forms of communication, social structure, and emotional life far richer than early scholarship allowed. Their dead were sometimes placed deliberately. Pigments and ornaments appear in some context associated with them. Their world was not a blank one. It was inhabited by meaning, though the exact shape of that meaning remains difficult to recover. This matters because the Ice Age ceases to look like the stage of a single species once Neanderthals are restored to it. It becomes instead a human plural. In some places, modern humans and Neanderthals existed in overlapping ranges. In some times, their worlds approached one another closely enough not only for conflict or avoidance, but for intimacy. Genetics has made that impossible to deny. Many living people outside Africa carry small but undeniable percentages of Neanderthal ancestry, evidence that these populations did not merely observe each other from a distance. They met in the oldest sense. Something passed between them that outlasted names, shelters, and the landscapes where it happened. And this is where the atmosphere of the Ice Age becomes strangely haunted. One can imagine two groups moving through the same valley generations apart and never knowing the other existed. But in at least some places, that is not what happened. There were encounters. Perhaps cautious, perhaps violent, perhaps curious, perhaps all of those at different times. A hearth found cold but recent. Tracks in snow that looked human and yet not entirely familiar. A shelter holding traces of occupation by hands that shaped stone differently. A face glimpsed across distance, recognizable and unsettling at once. How would such meetings have been understood? Not through taxonomy, not through the clinical clarity of later science. They would have been felt first through resemblance and difference. Another people, but not entirely other, a kinship that could not be named cleanly. The more closely one looks, the more the old boundary between them and us begins to dissolve. Neanderthals were not apes on the edge of humanity. They were humans of another form, another history, another adaptation to the cold. Their bodies were powerfully built, suited to demanding climates and strenuous lives. Their faces, once caricatured, now appear in reconstructions with a disarming familiarity. Not identical, no, but near enough to disturb the old comfort of distance. The Ice Age was therefore not only an age of glaciers and beasts, it was also an age in which the category of the human was wider than later memory would permit. That memory narrowed for reasons that are not entirely mysterious. Survival stories often simplify themselves after the fact. The lineage that remains tends to imagine its persistence as proof of superiority, yet extinction is not always a verdict on worth. It can be timing, numbers, climate instability, disease, absorption, competition over territory, or subtle disadvantages compounded over long periods. In the case of Neanderthals, scholars continue to debate the balance of these forces. Did abrupt climatic fluctuations fragment their populations? Did smaller social networks make recovery from loss more difficult? Did incoming modern humans outcompete them in some regions through broader exchange networks or more flexible resource use? Perhaps. But even if one or several of these explanations hold, they do not remove the deeper sadness. Another kind of human life endured the Ice Age for hundreds of thousands of years, then receded until only traces remained. And even remained is complicated. For Neanderthals did not vanish in a pure sense if part of them entered the line that continued. They were lost and not lost, erased and preserved. Gone as a distinct people, yet still present in immune responses, physical traits, and buried sequences of DNA carried unnoticed through modern populations. This is one of the strangest legacies of the Ice Age, that the ancient cold did not separate human forms as neatly as later categories would prefer. It brought them into contact, and contact left residue. The past survived not only in caves and bones, but under skin. There is also the problem of silence. Neanderthals left no writing, but neither did the early modern humans who lived beside them. Both worlds must therefore be approached through traces and inference. This creates a subtle danger. Modern people often fill the silence around extinct humans with whatever story best flatters the present. Sometimes that story is one of brute conquest. Sometimes it is sentimental harmony. The truth may have been more fractured. There may have been curiosity, trade, imitation, avoidance, rivalry, adoption, theft, intermarriage, violence, and misunderstanding, distributed unevenly across centuries and regions. The Ice Age was too large and too long to belong to one emotional script. Yet the possibility of shared symbolic life remains difficult to dismiss. If Neanderthals buried some of their dead with care, if they used pigments, if they occupied caves that later human groups would also fill with marks and meaning, then the cold world may have contained multiple human ways of facing mortality, memory, and darkness. There may have been more than one answer to winter, more than one answer to grief, more than one way of placing a body in the earth and feeling that the gesture mattered. That thought enlarges the Ice Age in a profound way. It was not only the childhood of modern humanity, it was a meeting ground of different human possibilities, and perhaps that is what makes their disappearance so difficult to think about calmly. It was not simply that a species ended, it was that one version of being human, with its own accumulated perceptions of cold, stone, hunger, kinship, and death, fell silent. An entire angle of consciousness may have gone with it. The world did not only lose bodies. It may have lost a way of sensing landscape, of enduring winter, of reading animal movement, of belonging to time. The surviving lineage inherited the earth, but inheritance is not the same as completeness. So the Ice Age, when viewed through Neanderthal eyes as much as through those of early modern humans, begins to feel less like a single ancestral trial and more like a chamber of echoes. Several kinds of human life moved through it. Some remained visible, some were absorbed, some were buried beyond easy recall. The cold preserved fragments, but not voices. And if another humanity once stood beside our own at the edge of firelight and vanished almost entirely from memory, then a more unsettling question begins to form in the dark. When the record falls silent, how can anyone be certain that what survived was the whole story of what it meant to be human there at all? Survival is often remembered afterward as a matter of strength, as though the cold selected only for harder muscles, tougher skin, and the stubborn refusal to die. But the deeper truth may be less dramatic and more unsettling. Severe worlds do not always reward brute force. They reward adjustment. They reward timing, restraint, memory, and the ability to notice what others miss. Under Ice Age conditions, the human body alone was never enough. It had to be extended outward, through hides, tools, fire, shelters, habits, and above all through other people. What endured in the cold was not simply the individual, but the network around the individual. And perhaps that is where one of the most important transformations took place, not only in what humans made, but in how they became necessary to one another. There is something humbling in the image of an Ice Age camp. Not the romantic version lit beautifully against snow, but the real thing. Smoke clinging low in frozen air, hides stiff with frost, damp fuel coaxed reluctantly into flame, hands cracked by labour, children needing constant protection, old injuries aching harder in the cold, food never fully secure, danger pressing from weather and hunger alike. Such a place was not saved by courage alone. It was saved by systems, the arrangement of shelter, the storing of fuel, the drying and cutting of meat, the maintenance of tools, the repair of clothing, the knowledge of who must stay close to the fire and who could still travel. In harsh climates, care becomes technical. Tenderness acquires structure. That may be one of the quiet secrets hidden beneath the usual story of Ice Age hardship. To survive repeated cold, humans had to become increasingly skillful, not just at confronting the environment, but at buffering one another from it. Clothing was not a small development. Tailored garments made from hide, sinew, fur, and perhaps woven plant fibres, or other perishables represented a remarkable extension of the human body into climates it could never have endured naked. Bone needles from later Paleolithic contexts hint at fitted clothing sophisticated enough to conserve heat efficiently. A well-made garment is not simply protection. It is stored attention. It is foresight that can be worn. Shelter, too, must be understood as more than cover. In Ice Age conditions, the difference between a poor shelter and a good one was not convenience. It was continuity. Archaeological traces from some upper Paleolithic sites suggest mammoth bone structures, tent-like dwellings, windbreaks, prepared hearth areas, and organised occupation surfaces. Not every region produced the same solutions, and not every shelter survives in the record, but the pattern is clear enough. Humans were not merely hiding from cold. They were engineering livable pockets inside it. They were creating interior climates, however fragile, within an exterior world that had ceased to be trustworthy. And fire, always present in the human imagination, becomes even more profound under such conditions. Fire is warmth, yes, but also time made visible. It extends waking into darkness. It dries clothing, hardens wood, deters predators, cooks food, softens social edges, and organizes bodies into a shared geometry of nearness. Around it, voices can lower, knowledge can pass, a child can learn where not to touch, when to listen, which story matters, how to prepare for tomorrow. If cold changed consciousness, then fire may have been one of its mediators, not merely a tool, but the centre around which memory became durable enough to outlast a season. Yet even these technologies do not fully explain Ice Age survival. The more decisive adaptation may have been social. A lone human, however clever, would have had little chance against prolonged severe cold, shifting prey, injury, illness, and the demands of resource transport and child rearing. Cooperation was not a moral luxury, it was infrastructure. Food sharing, coordinated hunting, role differentiation, care for the vulnerable, teaching, and perhaps forms of reciprocal obligation more binding than modern individualism easily imagines. All of these may have been sharpened by glacial pressure. In difficult environments, selfishness becomes expensive, isolation becomes fatal. Some researchers have suggested that ecological hardship may have favoured greater interdependence, stronger information sharing, and wider social networks among Upper Paleolithic populations. While the exact mechanisms remain debated, the logic is difficult to ignore. A larger web of allies increases access to mates, resources, and knowledge. Exchange networks can move stone, shell, pigment, and perhaps stories across distances larger than any one group regularly travelled. What looks at first like ornament or trade may also be resilience distributed across space. A bead or pigment fragment may be more than decoration. It may be a sign that no group survived entirely alone. This possibility begins to blur the boundary between adaptation and culture. The techniques that kept people alive in the cold were not separate from the meanings that held people together. A garment may have had a practical cut, but also a recognizable pattern. A tool might be efficient, but also signal group identity. A hearth arrangement may serve warmth, yet also reproduce habit and belonging. Under repeated environmental uncertainty, the familiar itself becomes functional. Ritual, repetition, and shared forms reduce confusion. They tell the body where safety begins. They transform survival from improvisation into inheritance. And inheritance in such a world could not rely on writing. It lived in repetition, correction, and embodied memory. Hands showed other hands how to scrape hides, set points, read snow, bank coals, build windbreaks, preserve marrow, identify danger, and move without wasting heat. The knowledge was practical, but not mechanical. It was moral in the oldest sense because failure to transmit it carried consequences beyond the self. One missing detail could become another person's death. In this way, Ice Age life may have intensified the seriousness of teaching. Instruction was not enrichment. It was continuity under threat. Perhaps that is why the human story of cold does not feel merely physical. It feels developmental. Severe environments may have drawn out capacities that later civilizations would take for granted, without remembering where they were tested so hard. Delayed gratification, planning, cooperative logistics, emotional regulation under stress, long apprenticeship, and attention to cyclical time. To prepare for a hard season requires faith in a future one cannot yet feel. It requires abstraction grounded in necessity. One stores for what is absent. One labours for what is not yet here. Cold, in this sense, may have trained human beings to live mentally beyond the immediate moment. But no adaptation is perfect, and no climate permits mastery for long. The very systems that helped humans endure also made them more dependent on continuity they could not fully control. A group that survives through clothing needs hides, needles, skill, and prey. A group that survives through cooperation needs trust. A group that survives through memory needs elders, stable transmission, and enough repetition for knowledge to settle. Severe pressure strengthens, but it also exposes fragility. Once the system is disrupted by rapid weather change, animal decline, illness, conflict, or displacement, every layer of adaptation can begin to tremble. That may be the darker lesson hidden inside the ingenuity of Ice Age survival. Humans did not conquer the cold once and for all. They built provisional islands of order within it, and those islands had to be remade again and again. Every shelter was temporary. Every fire demanded tending. Every hide wore thin. Every route could fail. Every generation had to recover the world almost from the beginning. Survival, then, was not a final state. It was a disciplined repetition against forgetting. And perhaps forgetting was the greater enemy all along. Not only forgetting where the herd passed last winter, or how to stitch a seam tightly enough to keep a child alive, but forgetting that human beings were shaped in crisis by dependence, not independence. Around the fire, inside hides, beneath wind-struck skies, the species may have learned that intelligence without relationship is too narrow to last. Yet this raises a more unsettling possibility. If the first Ice Age humans survived by building fragile systems of memory, care, and shared technique against an unstable world, what happened when the instability deepened faster than those systems could carry it? When survival itself began to demand not only adaptation, but explanation? There are memories that survive by remaining accurate, and there are others that survive only by changing shape. The first kind can be checked against dates, strata, bones, and tools. The second lives longer in a more elusive form. It drifts into images, motifs, warnings, sacred patterns, and stories told so often that no one remembers where the first telling began. This is where the Ice Age story grows more uncertain, but also more difficult to dismiss. If the first humans experienced repeated cold, vanishing landscapes, unstable seasons, drowned coasts, and sudden ecological reversals, then it is not unreasonable to wonder whether some echo of those conditions lingered long after the events themselves were forgotten. Not as clean testimony, not as history in the modern sense, but as myth. This is the point at which caution becomes necessary. Too many later ages have tried to force ancient myths into simple codes, as though every flood story must preserve a literal flood, every tale of darkness a volcanic winter, every account of a lost world, a drowned continent waiting to be rediscovered. The temptation is understandable. Myth feels like memory wearing ceremonial clothing. But myths do not operate like archives. They compress, distort, moralize, and reassign causes. They mix natural trauma with social fear, cosmic order with political legitimacy, ancestral experience with ritual need. To look for Ice Age memory inside them is not foolish. To expect a direct transcription would be, and yet the recurring patterns remain strangely persistent. Across widely separated cultures appear motifs of great cold, prolonged darkness, world flood, vanished ages, migrations from ruined lands, and catastrophic breaks between earlier and later conditions. Some of these are almost certainly products of universal human anxieties rather than shared historical memory. Human beings everywhere know winter, death, scarcity, and the terror of losing order. But not every motif can be reduced so easily to psychological inevitability. Some traditions seem to preserve an oddly specific sense that the world was once configured differently, that the sea stood elsewhere, that an older time ended violently, that human beings inherited their present condition from some break they could no longer fully explain. One need not become credulous to feel the force of that possibility. Oral traditions can preserve information over astonishing lengths of time under the right conditions, though usually in transformed form. In recent decades, some researchers have explored whether certain indigenous stories in different parts of the world may preserve memories of post-glacial sea level rise, volcanic events, or ancient landscape change. These arguments vary in strength, and some are stronger than others, but the broader insight is difficult to ignore. Human communities do not always lose environmental memory completely when writing is absent. Sometimes memory migrates into narrative. It survives because it becomes meaningful enough to retell. The emotional logic of this makes sense. A coastline slowly swallowed by rising water is not merely a geographic event. It is the loss of familiar ground, ancestral roots, camps, burial places, and food sources. A sudden cold reversal after an apparent warming is not simply a climate oscillation. It is betrayal by the season itself. Such experiences would not remain inert in collective thought. They would gather symbolic charge. The sea would become more than water. Winter would become more than weather. Migration would become more than movement. Each would enter story as an actor, a warning, a punishment, a mystery, or a wound. This may help explain why later mythological systems so often frame cosmic disorder through environmental imagery. A world flood does not need to be a journalistic report to preserve the emotional truth of inundation. A tale of the sun disappearing or light withdrawing may not record one event, yet still speak to inherited fear of climatic instability, ash-darkened skies, or winters that seem to overtake expectation. Stories of previous ages, destroyed peoples, divine resets, and failed worlds may emerge partly because human beings living far from the Pleistocene still sensed, however dimly, that the earth had not always behaved gently toward them. Of course, there is a danger in saying this. Once myth is treated as possible memory, speculation expands quickly. Lost civilizations are proposed where evidence is thin. Symbolic material is stretched into certainty. Every ancient catastrophe becomes linked to every other. This script does not need those excesses. The more unsettling possibility is quieter. It is that traces of Ice Age experience may persist in later traditions not because an unbroken line of factual recall survived, but because the human mind is porous across generations in ways history cannot easily quantify. Environments leave marks on survival strategies, social structures, and patterns of fear. Those marks influence ritual. Ritual shapes narrative. Narrative outlives context. By the time the story is written down, its earliest layer may already be unrecognizable. That does not make it meaningless. On the contrary, it may make it more revealing. A myth that cannot be read literally may still reveal what kinds of rupture people considered thinkable. If later societies repeatedly imagined the world as vulnerable to flood, darkness, winter, and cyclical destruction, that alone says something important. It suggests that humanity did not experience history as an unbroken ascent. Beneath official order, there remained an older suspicion that stability could fail suddenly, and that what had once been lost might be lost again. Perhaps this is why origin stories so often contain remnants of catastrophe. The beginning is imagined not only as creation, but as recovery, emergence, separation from chaos, or re-establishment after collapse. In some traditions, humanity survives because it is warned. In others, because a few endure a flood or winter or cosmic disorder while others vanish. Such stories may arise independently again and again, but their recurrence still matters. They show that the human imagination has long been organized around discontinuity. The world does not simply continue, it can break. That may be one of the deepest inheritances from glacial prehistory, whether directly remembered or not. There is another layer to the problem as well. Later institutions of religion and empire often shaped which stories were preserved, sanctioned, rewritten, or dismissed. This does not require a single grand conspiracy to be significant. Systems of authority naturally prefer cosmologies that reinforce order. Oral traditions that carry ambiguous memories of older ruptures, drowned places, or forgotten peoples may survive only at the margins, embedded in folklore, local sacred geographies, or ritual fragments no dominant archive fully absorbs. In that sense, the past may be filtered twice, first by time and environmental loss, then by later systems of knowledge deciding what counts as legitimate memory. This may explain why so many ancient stories feel as though they are speaking through a veil. Something urgent is there, but displaced. A mountain remembers a flood. A coast remembers vanished land. A people remembers movement from somewhere no one can now identify with confidence. A ritual reenacts a danger that no participant has literally known. The details blur, the emotional structure remains. Loss, warning, transition, survival. Again and again, the same architecture appears, as though humanity keeps returning to one old room in the dark and touching the walls to confirm it is still there. It would be too much to say that later myths prove what the first Ice Age humans experienced. They do not. But perhaps proof is not the only form of continuity worth noticing. There is also persistence of mood, persistence of suspicion, persistence of recurring images that gather wherever human beings try to speak about a world that does not always preserve the lives built within it. Myth, then, may not be the record of the Ice Age, but one of its distant afterlives. Not a transcript, but a residue. Not a map, but an echo travelling through chambers of time. And echoes become more haunting when one considers how much of the material record has already been lost. If coastlines drowned, populations shifted, and oral worlds fractured across millennia, then perhaps myth became one of the last vessels capable of carrying the emotional truth of ancient rupture across impossible distance. By the time later civilizations inscribed those stories, the witnesses were gone, the landscapes altered, the causes blurred. Still the themes remained: flood, winter, darkness, exile, return, survival after a broken world. The question is not whether every one of these stories is secretly about the Ice Age. It is whether the oldest human encounter with planetary instability left an imprint so deep that even when memory forgot the event, imagination refused to forget the feeling. And if that feeling endured, then perhaps the next mystery is not how humans survived the cold, but what happened when the cold itself began to end in ways no story could safely contain. Warmth does not always arrive as mercy. Sometimes it arrives as instability. A world long disciplined by cold can become dangerous in entirely new ways when the ice begins to loosen its hold. Rivers swell beyond memory, glacial lakes strain against their boundaries, frozen ground softens into mud, and coastlines that once felt permanent begin their slow surrender to the sea. What later ages might call recovery may not have felt like recovery at all to those living through it. It may have felt like another phase of uncertainty, another rearrangement of the terms of existence, another lesson that the earth was not returning anything simply because it had once taken it away. The end of the Ice Age is often imagined as a great release, the closing of one harsh chapter and the opening of a more habitable world. In broad climatic terms, that is not untrue. Temperatures rose, ice sheets retreated, new ecosystems expanded. Over long spans, conditions emerged that would eventually support agriculture, denser settlements, and the forms of memory later called civilization. But to compress that transformation into a single upward arc is to miss the terror inside the transition. The Earth did not pass gently from cold to warmth. It lurched, it surged, it reversed. It opened some futures while erasing others. What ended was not only the reign of ice. What ended too may have been entire human ways of reading the world. The late glacial period was marked by abrupt climate fluctuations that would have been deeply disorienting at the scale of lived experience. Warmer intervals appeared, then faltered. The Younger Dryas in particular still stands like a warning in paleoclimate research, a return to colder conditions after a phase of warming, beginning roughly 12,900 years ago and lasting more than a millennium. To modernise this as a chapter in scientific chronology, to the people inside it, if they could have described it at all, it may have felt like betrayal by the world itself. A thaw had begun to suggest one future, and then another reality forced its way back in. Expectations would have become unstable. Knowledge inherited from one generation might fail in the next. The season itself could no longer be trusted to remember what it had seemed to promise. There is something especially haunting in the possibility that these abrupt reversals struck human communities at the very moment they had begun adjusting to new patterns. Adaptation requires rhythm. It depends on repeated observations gradually becoming reliable enough to build around. But what happens when the pattern shifts just as it is being learned? When a migration route no longer works, not because it was poorly chosen, but because the landscape changed faster than memory could keep pace. This is the deeper cruelty of climatic volatility. It does not simply create hardship. It makes experience less portable. It weakens the authority of elders, confuses expectations, and turns skill into uncertainty more quickly than culture can comfortably absorb. The geological record preserves signs of this turbulence. Melting ice sheets released immense volumes of fresh water into the oceans. Glacial lakes formed and failed. Sea levels did not rise in one smooth motion, but in pulses, steps, and episodes of acceleration. Entire lowland worlds were gradually consumed. The outlines of continents narrowed toward their modern forms, but that narrowing meant loss for the people living along the edges. Estuaries vanished. Hunting grounds drowned. Camps that once stood inland became shorelines, then sea floor. In such conditions, warming was not simply liberation from frost. It was dispossession by water. This is where the emotional structure of flood memory becomes newly relevant. A community need not witness one single unimaginable deluge for inundation to become central to its inherited fear. Repeated transgressions of the sea, swallowed coasts, unstable rivers, and the steady retreat of usable land would have been enough to teach a grim lesson. The world could remove what it had long allowed. If cold had introduced humanity to scarcity and exposure, thaw may have introduced it to submergence and instability. Both were forms of loss. Both demanded movement. Both made continuity fragile. Naturally, where instability leaves room, hypotheses multiply. Some are careful, supported by strong evidence of abrupt climate events, meltwater pulses, and ecological disruption. Others are more controversial, including proposals that extraterrestrial impacts contributed to the onset of the Younger Dryas, or intensified its effects. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains debated, challenged, defended, revised, and far from settled. It should not be treated as established fact. Yet the persistence of that debate says something important in itself. Researchers continue to search for explanations that account for the sharpness and scale of change. Because the transition appears, even now, too abrupt in some respects to feel fully domesticated by simple narrative. One does not need a cosmic impact to recognize catastrophe in the late glacial world. Extinction, migration, ecological fragmentation, and climatic unpredictability are sufficient to create the atmosphere of rupture. Still, The appeal of impact theories reveals a deeper human instinct. When the world changes too violently, the mind searches for a blow commensurate with the wound. It wants an event large enough to explain the break. Sometimes such an event exists, sometimes it does not. Sometimes the wound is the cumulative result of countless shifts, each survivable on its own, devastating in sequence. The Ice Age may have ended not through one singular apocalypse, but through a chain of transformations whose combined effect felt apocalyptic to those trapped within them. This distinction matters. A civilization reset is often imagined as sudden, dramatic, cinematic. But many worlds end more quietly. A shoreline disappears a little each generation. A prey species no longer returns in its former numbers. A cold-adapted rhythm collapses under warming, then a warming rhythm collapses under renewed cold. Burial grounds are abandoned not because memory fails, but because access fails. Children inherit stories tied to places their own feet will never reach. The archive of a people does not burn. It sinks. It silts over. It scatters into new landscapes where old references no longer make sense. In that slower form of catastrophe, almost nothing looks spectacular from the outside, yet everything is altered. Perhaps this is why the end of the Ice Age feels less like a clean conclusion than a broken threshold. Much of later human history stands on the other side of it, yet something on the earlier side was lost in the crossing. Not merely species, not merely glaciers, but habits of perception. Entire ways of understanding time, land, and danger may have become obsolete or fragmentary as the planet reorganized itself. The people who endured the transition were not stepping toward modernity with confidence. They were being pushed through a corridor of environmental confusion toward futures they could not have named. And because those futures eventually produced writing, agriculture, monuments, and states, the earlier losses are easy to understate. Later civilizations often look backward through the lens of their own emergence and mistake what came before as prelude. But preludes do not usually drown. They do not vanish under rising seas. They do not fracture into myths of flood, darkness, and former ages without reason. The end of the Ice Age was not simply the beginning of the world that followed. For many communities, it may have been the destruction of the world they knew best. This raises a troubling possibility. If the transition out of the Ice Age involved repeated shocks, drowned landscapes, ecological collapses, and cultural dislocations, then later history may be founded not only on adaptation, but on amnesia. Civilizations may have risen on the far side of losses too old and too submerged to remember clearly. The first great human archive may not have been destroyed by fire, but by thaw. And if that is true, then what now appears as the dawn of settled history may also conceal a graveyard beneath it, a drowned inheritance whose absence shaped everything that came after, even as almost no one remained to say what had been taken. There are landscapes the human species may remember only by instinct now, not by name. Plains where rivers once braided through cold grass, estuaries rich with birds and shellfish, low hills that watched campfires for generations, valleys where children learned the shape of tides before tides came farther in. All of it gone, not in myth alone, but in geography. The map changed, water rose, shores retreated, and the places most likely to have held long stretches of human life may now lie under the weight of dark, patient sea. It is difficult to think of a more silent kind of disappearance than that. Not burned, not shattered, not conquered, but drowned so gradually that memory itself may have been forced to walk inland while the old world sank behind it. The modern imagination still tends to picture prehistory on land that resembles the present, as though the continents were always shaped for current coastlines, and today's waters merely frame an ancient drama. But during the height of glacial conditions, sea levels were far lower than they are now. Vast continental shelves lay exposed. Shorelines extended outward into regions now submerged beneath oceans and shallow seas. river mouths lay farther from the present coast. Dry land connected places now divided by water, some of the most favourable habitats for human settlement, ecologically rich, seasonally productive, relatively moderate compared with harsher interiors, may have existed on land that has been hidden since the end of the Ice Age. This means the archaeological record is almost certainly skewed. What survives on present land is not necessarily where humans lived most intensely. It is often where evidence happened to escape inundation, erosion, or later destruction. The deep past is being reconstructed from a map already edited by the ocean. That fact alone should make every account of early humanity sound a little less complete than it often does. Not because scholarship is careless, but because the planet has rearranged the archive before scholarship ever arrived. The implications are difficult to overstate. Coastal zones offer food diversity, transport routes, freshwater access, and ecological abundance. Even highly mobile hunter-gatherers would have found such environments attractive under many conditions. Shellfish, fish runs, seabirds, estuarine plants, marine mammals, and the broader meeting point of inland and maritime resources could support repeated occupation, seasonal return, and perhaps dense cultural memory. If large portions of these coastal worlds disappeared beneath rising seas after the glacial period, then entire chapters of human adaptation, symbolism, technology, and movement may now lie outside easy reach. Not invisible in principle, but hidden behind technical, financial, and geological barriers so severe that absence can easily masquerade as non-existence. There is something philosophically unsettling about this. Historians and archaeologists are trained properly to be cautious with claims unsupported by evidence. Yet what happens when the evidence was most likely preserved in places that later became difficult to investigate at all? Caution remains necessary, but so does humility. The absence of extensive remains on modern coasts does not automatically mean sparse human activity in ancient coastal worlds. It may mean those worlds are underwater, sealed beneath sediment, or damaged by millennia of marine action. The silence may be real, but it may not be original. This helps explain why submerged landscapes have become such a compelling frontier in the study of prehistory. From the North Sea's lost terrain, often called Doggerland, to drowned shelf regions in Southeast Asia, sometimes discussed under the broad idea of Sunderland, to submerged coastal zones in the Americas and elsewhere, researchers have begun piecing together a picture of vanished lowlands that once held animals, rivers, forests, wetlands, and likely human presence. None of this proves secret empires or forgotten high civilizations in the grandiose style popular imagination likes to invent. The truth is quieter and in some ways more moving. It suggests that ordinary human lives, camps, routes, meals, burials, fires, stories, unfolded on ground that later became inaccessible. The missing world may not have been fantastical. It may have been intimate. And intimacy is exactly what makes the loss feel so heavy. A monumental city destroyed by catastrophe leaves a dramatic scar in history. A long-favoured coastal route slowly drowned by post-glacial sea rise leaves almost none. Yet for the people affected, the second loss may have been just as profound. A fishing place inherited across generations disappears. A marsh where birds reliably nested becomes tidal water. A burial ridge erodes away. A safe inlet turns hostile. Paths known through memory no longer meet land where they once did. The sea does not merely take territory, it breaks orientation. It severs continuity between story and place. This is perhaps the most painful consequence of drowned landscapes. They damage memory structurally. Human beings remember best when stories can be anchored to visible terrain. The hill is there. The river bend is there. The cave still opens where ancestors said it would. But when coastlines withdraw and old landmarks vanish underwater, memory must either transform or fade. It grows more symbolic, less topographical. Directions become legends. Place names lose reference. Warnings remain, but their original coordinates dissolve. Over many generations, an actual drowned land can become a mythical one, not because it never existed, but because the world that verified it has gone. This may be one of the hidden engines behind later traditions of sunken realms, western isles, vanished shores, ancestral countries beneath the sea, and stories of people displaced by advancing waters. Not every such story is a literal recollection of post-glacial inundation. That would be too simple. Yet the recurring motif of land lost to water is difficult to ignore in a species whose coastal archive was repeatedly submerged at the end of the Pleistocene. The emotional truth of those stories may be older than the cultures that preserved them. Something about drowning land seems to reach deeply into human fear, perhaps because so much of early human life was tied to literal worlds that no longer exist. There is, too, a subtle challenge to the standard imagination of progress here. If some of the richest evidence of early human ingenuity lies underwater, then later history may stand atop a misunderstanding of where complexity first gathered. The assumption that inland monumental culture marks the true beginning of meaningful human organisation may partly reflect what survived on dry ground, not the full geography of human capability. Coastal life can be sophisticated without leaving stone architecture. Seasonal knowledge, watercraft, food processing, exchange networks, ritual practices tied to tide and migration, and a dense sense of place do not necessarily fossilise well. A people can be highly adapted, symbolically rich, and structurally organised, while leaving behind remains too fragile for easy preservation. The ocean does not only hide objects, it hides disproportions in the story later told about them. That does not justify fantasy. It does not allow every speculative theory to pass as insight. But it does require one hard concession. Early human history is very likely more maritime, more coastal, and more submerged than the surviving terrestrial record alone suggests. Once that is admitted, the shape of the Ice Age narrative changes again. The first humans did not merely endure cold interiors and migrate across open plains. Many of them may also have lived at the edge of waters that behave differently from those known today, developing relationships with coast, tide, estuary, and seasonal abundance whose evidence now lies underwater or has been scattered beyond recovery. And if drowned landscapes account for part of the missing record, then perhaps prehistory is not only incomplete because it is old. It is incomplete because some of its most habitable rooms were flooded before later humanity could inherit them. This gives the end of the Ice Age a second kind of violence. It did not just alter climate, it repossessed memory. It lifted the sea over campsites, crossings, hearths, and burial grounds, then allowed later civilizations to believe the silence meant little had ever happened there. But what if the silence was manufactured by water? What if the most formative chapters of early human life were not erased by ignorance, but hidden in plain sight beneath coastlines the modern world mistakes for permanent? If that is even partly true, then the sea is not merely background to human history. It may be one of its oldest sensors. Long before cities raised stone toward the sky, before kings claimed the favour of heaven, before priests fixed calendars into tablets and walls, there may already have been a quieter science taking shape in the cold. Not science in the later formal sense, not a discipline separated from ritual or survival, but a prolonged act of attention. The first humans who endured severe glacial worlds could not survive by reacting only to what was directly in front of them. They had to notice repetition. They had to remember return. They had to sense that the world, however unstable, still moved in patterns deep enough to be followed. And somewhere within that pressure, time itself may have changed from a simple passing of days into something more deliberate, more observed, almost sacred. A harsh environment does not merely threaten the body. It trains the mind to ask when. When will the herds return? When will the river open? When does the snow begin to soften? And when does it deceive? When does the moon rise at the right hour for travel, or the dark deepen enough to hide danger? These questions seem practical, but practical questions repeated over generations rarely remain only practical. They accumulate ceremony around them. They become tied to memory, expectation, and authority. The person who knows when may become as important as the person who knows how. In this way, the oldest forms of timekeeping may not have emerged from leisure or abstract curiosity, but from repeated danger. Archaeology offers only fragments here, and the fragments resist certainty. Some marked bones, notched objects, and recurring sequences have invited speculation about tallying, lunar observation, or seasonal tracking. The famous Ishanga bone, though much later than the earliest Ice Age populations and still debated in interpretation, often appears in discussions of early numerical awareness. Other engraved objects from Upper Paleolithic contexts have been read by some researchers as possible notational systems, perhaps tied to cycles of animal behaviour, lunar phases, or reproductive timing. None of these readings is universally accepted. Caution is justified. Yet the debate itself reveals something important. The surviving record contains patterns that repeatedly tempt the modern mind to suspect structured attention to recurring natural rhythms. This suspicion grows stronger when one remembers what severe climates demand. A people living through glacial or late glacial instability could not afford to treat time as vague. Migration, hunting, shelter maintenance, clothing preparation, fuel gathering, and reproductive survival all depended on anticipating change before it fully arrived. The sky, the moon, the stars, the length of shadows, the behaviour of animals, the first shift in wind, the quality of thaw, these were not decorative features of existence. They were signals. To ignore them was to step into danger unprepared. The first calendars, then, may not have been objects at all. They may have been habits of synchronizing the body with recurring signs. What survives in the archaeological record may only be the hardened residue of a much larger system of embodied reckoning. A notch on bone could be a count, or something else entirely. A repeated mark could be decoration, memory aid, or a sign lost beyond retrieval. This ambiguity frustrates the modern desire for proof. But perhaps the deeper issue is that early timekeeping would not necessarily look like later calendars. It may have existed as chant, sequence, route timing, ritual prohibition, hand gesture, storytelling structure, or the ordered memory of elders who knew that one event followed another by a rhythm too important to trust to chance. In oral worlds, recurrence itself is a kind of archive. The night sky would have played its own role in this discipline of noticing. Contrary to the later assumption that astronomy belongs first to settled monument builders, Paleolithic people lived under skies far darker and more visually commanding than most modern humans can imagine. In glacial environments, away from artificial light, stars would have been unavoidable companions. Their regularity, unlike the unstable land, may have offered one of the few dependable structures available. The moon waxed and thinned. Constellations rose and withdrew seasonally. Solstices shifted the length of light and darkness with grave consequences for movement and mood. A people does not need formal observatories to begin taking these patterns seriously. It only needs enough generations of hardship to understand that the sky keeps certain promises even when the earth does not. This has led some scholars and thinkers to speculate, cautiously or boldly depending on the case, that some Upper Paleolithic imagery or repeated signs might encode astronomical awareness. There are controversial claims about constellational references in cave art, alignments of images to celestial symbolism, or seasonal notation linked to animal cycles. Many of these arguments remain disputed, and some likely say more than the evidence can bear. Still, it would be equally naive to assume that Ice Age humans, for all their attentiveness, never connected recurring celestial phenomena with terrestrial survival. The issue is not whether they practiced astronomy as a formal science. It is whether they lived under a sky they had learned not to ignore. That is a far more modest claim, and a far more convincing one. If so, then the earlier sacredness of time may have emerged not from temples but from dependence. To wait for the return of a herd is already to enter ritualized expectation. To prepare before winter based on remembered signs is already to trust a cycle larger than immediate perception. To mark those cycles, even informally, is to admit that life is not merely a series of isolated emergencies. It unfolds within a recurring order that can be learned imperfectly and violated at a cost. Here, practicality and reverence begin to overlap. What is counted becomes important. What is important becomes protected. What is protected becomes ceremonial. There is something quietly profound in that overlap. Modern thought often separates knowledge into categories: science here, religion there, art elsewhere, survival beneath them all. But the first humans living through severe climatic stress may have inhabited these things as one fabric. To watch the moon could be practical and sacred. To remember a sequence of animal movement could be empirical and mythic. To gather at a certain place at a certain season could be ecological strategy and ancestral obedience at once. The modern distinction between rational adaptation and symbolic meaning may say little about how Ice Age minds actually organised reality. And perhaps that is why later civilization looks both like a new beginning and a forgetting. Once writing appears, calendars become externalized. Time is fixed outside the body. It can be stored, standardized, administered. That is an extraordinary development, but it may also conceal older forms of temporal intelligence that left few durable marks. Before numbers ruled time from tablets, time may have lived in scars, songs, notches, breath, and the trained expectations of people who could not survive unless they remembered the rhythm of a difficult world. Such memory leaves less for museums, but perhaps more for human inheritance, because inheritance may be the real subject here. The Ice Age did not simply challenge humans to endure cold, it may have taught them to live by recurrence, to notice pattern beneath instability, to suspect that survival depends on aligning with cycles too large to command. In that sense, one of the first beginnings of civilization may not have been farming, walls, or kingship. It may have been the moment a human group realized that time itself could be read, anticipated, and shared. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough to turn fear into preparation. Yet this insight leads toward another discomfort. If early humans learned to rely on recurring signals in sky, animal movement, and season, what happened when those signals began to fail? When abrupt climate reversals, rising seas, and ecological disruption broke the old correspondences between observation and outcome? A people can survive uncertainty for a long time, but when the very patterns that once preserved life grow unreliable, attention alone is no longer enough. It becomes something more troubled, something closer to vigilance, edged with doubt. And from that doubt, perhaps, the next layer of history begins. Not merely the desire to read the world, but the urge to ask who later claimed the authority to explain it. At some point, every uncertain memory meets an institution that prefers certainty. The world may have been unstable, coastlines may have drowned, climates may have lurched, and the oldest human experiences may have survived only in fragments of symbol, root, burial, and myth. Yet later systems of knowledge have always felt an understandable need to smooth the jagged edges. Disorder is difficult to teach, ambiguity is difficult to preserve, a broken past resists administration. So history, especially once states, priesthoods, empires, and formal schools begin to shape it, tends to favour cleaner thresholds. This was the beginning, this was the cause, this was the people, this was the order that followed. And perhaps that is where another kind of silence entered the story of the Ice Age. Not deliberate fabrication in every case, but the gradual narrowing of what later ages found acceptable to remember. This does not require a shadowy conspiracy to matter. Human institutions do not need secret councils to simplify the past. They do it naturally. Archives privilege what can be written. Doctrine privileges what can be stabilized. Formal education privileges what can be divided into sequences clear enough to repeat. The deeper and more fractured the past becomes, the more pressure there is to render it legible. By the time ancient civilizations began creating durable records, the Ice Age already belonged to a darkness beyond direct recall. What could be preserved of it would be filtered through myth, inherited custom, sacred narrative, regional memory, and later interpretation. And later interpretation, however learned, is rarely neutral. It inherits the needs of its own age. One of those needs is chronology. Civilizations like to know when they began. Legitimacy often depends on it. The founding city, the first king, the revelation, the migration, the covenant, the law. These anchor collective identity. But glacial prehistory resists neat beginnings because it suggests that human life was already complex, adaptive, symbolic, and haunted by rupture long before the rise of states. It pushes origins backward into a terrain that writing cannot master. That can be unsettling even for modern secular thought, which often replaces sacred origin stories with academic ones while retaining the same appetite for clean thresholds. The date changes. The desire for order remains. So the Ice Age is often framed as prelude. Necessary, important, even dramatic, but still essentially background to the real story that begins with agriculture, cities, literacy, and administration. This is not entirely wrong. Those developments did transform the human condition. But the framing carries a hidden assumption that what came before mattered mainly because it led to what came after. It turns deep human experience into preparation, and preparation by definition is not allowed full sovereignty. It is always subordinate to the thing it precedes. In that sense, prehistory may have been diminished not because scholars deny its importance, but because narrative structure itself quietly demotes it. This becomes even more significant when evidence is incomplete. Drowned coastlines, perishable materials, fragmentary sites, uncertain symbolic systems, and the absence of writing all create a past that must be interpreted with care. But caution can sometimes harden into a kind of intellectual defensiveness. Speculative excess is a real danger, and rigorous scholarship rightly resists fantasy. Yet there is another danger too, the reflex to treat anything insufficiently preserved as probably insignificant. What cannot be cleanly demonstrated is pushed outward, into footnotes, into fringe zones, into topics mentioned with discomfort or not at all. The result is not outright censorship. It is a subtler act of trimming possibility to fit the archive as it survives. And the archive survives unevenly. That is the point most difficult to keep alive. A river valley does not preserve like a cave. A woven object does not preserve like stone. A drowned coast does not preserve like a dry plateau. A ritual encoded in performance does not preserve like a text. If later systems of knowledge privilege what is durable, monumental, and written, then they are almost destined to underrepresent entire domains of early human life. What vanishes physically becomes easier to dismiss conceptually. Over time, the surviving record begins to teach not only what remains, but what later minds are permitted to imagine once remained. This is where some people become tempted by the language of suppression. Sometimes that language overreaches. Not every gap is evidence of a cover-up. Not every academic disagreement conceals ideological policing. But institutions do shape memory, and they do so through authority, funding, prestige, curriculum, and the boundaries of what counts as serious. A hypothesis too speculative may be excluded for good reason. Another may be excluded because it unsettles habits of thought more than the evidence warrants. The line between prudence and rigidity is not always easy to see from inside a system. The history of science and scholarship is filled with cases in which caution protected truth, and others in which caution delayed it. The Ice Age sits uncomfortably inside this tension because it invites questions that are both legitimate and difficult to settle. How much early human life is missing because coasts drowned? How much symbolic behaviour is invisible because it was performed in perishable media? How much environmental trauma survives only in distorted later traditions? How much human diversity was lost when lineages like the Neanderthals disappeared? None of these questions requires wild invention, yet each opens onto a version of the past that is less clean, less centralized, and less flattering to the tidy ascent narratives later societies prefer. They suggest humanity did not rise through one obvious staircase. It moved through fracture, loss, adaptation, and partial forgetting. Religious systems have their own relationship to such forgetting. Many of them preserved myths of earlier ages, floods, destructions, migrations, and resets, while also reordering those materials into moral and theological frameworks suited to their own communities. An inherited story of environmental catastrophe might become a judgment myth. A memory of displacement might become sacred exile. A local tradition of ancestral emergence might be folded into imperial cosmology. This was not necessarily deceit. It was interpretation under conditions of inheritance. But the effect is still transformative. By the time a story reaches scripture, chronicle, or official doctrine, its oldest layers may already have been bent toward later meaning. Empires do something similar with geography. They turn lived landscapes into mapped possessions. Once that happens, places begin to matter according to administration, not ancestral memory alone. A drowned land no longer visible is harder to defend as meaningful. A vanished route ceases to count. A people displaced multiple times may keep fragments of older orientation, but without monuments or written territorial claims, their memory can be dismissed as legend. The state recognizes what it can tax, border, sanctify, or conquer. Everything older and less fixed risks being left outside legitimacy. Thus, the archive of power and the archive of deep human experience slowly part ways. Modern scholarship, to its credit, has challenged many of these inherited blind spots. Archaeology, genetics, paleoclimatology, and comparative myth studies have all widened the field. The human story is now understood to be older, more entangled, more migratory, and more climatically shaped than many earlier systems allowed. Yet even now, the pressure toward coherence remains. The public prefers strong narratives. Educational systems prefer stable summaries. Media prefers conclusions. And so the Ice Age, with all its missing coasts, uncertain symbols, plural humanities, and broken transitions, continues to resist domestication. It remains too large for one institution to fully own. Perhaps that is precisely why it matters. A past that cannot be fully stabilized is a mirror the present often avoids. It reminds modern people that knowledge is not identical to possession, that archives are incomplete by nature, and that entire worlds can shape later history while surviving only as residue. The first humans who experienced glacial realities did not leave a clear doctrine of what was happening to them. Later ages inherited the fragments and built systems sturdy enough to govern memory. But sturdy systems are not the same as complete ones. Sometimes what appears most settled is only the visible crust over a much older field of uncertainty. And once that is admitted, another troubling question rises. If later institutions, religious, imperial, academic, even modern, have all in their own ways narrowed, organized, or disciplined what can be said about the deep past, then how much of early human experience remains unrecognized, not because it lacked importance, but because it did not survive in forms authority knows how to trust? If the first Ice Age humans left behind a world of knowledge too embodied, too scattered, too drowned, and too symbolically transformed to fit later archives, then perhaps the greatest loss was not only the events themselves, but the standards by which future civilizations decided what counted as history at all. The oldest climates do not remain only in ice cores and sediments. Some part of them may remain in posture, in preference, in fear, in the subtle architecture of human comfort. A fire in darkness still calms the nervous system. Enclosure still feels safer than open exposure to many people. Sudden weather shifts still provoke unease disproportionate to their immediate danger. The modern world likes to imagine itself psychologically distant from prehistory, as though electricity, walls, and written memory severed all deeper inheritance. But the body is not so quick to modernize. It carries older instructions quietly. And if the first humans were shaped by long intimacy with cold, instability, migration, and loss, then perhaps the Ice Age did not truly end inside the human mind. It only withdrew from conscious recognition. This is, of course, a delicate claim. One must be careful not to turn every modern anxiety into a fossil. Human beings fear darkness for many reasons. They seek shelter, warmth, repetition, and social nearness in patterns explainable through ordinary psychology and everyday experience. Yet ordinary psychology itself has a history. It emerged through bodies selected, pressured, and instructed by environments far older than civilization. The species did not develop its emotional reflexes in cities. It developed them under skies without insulation, in landscapes where sound in the night could mean hunger, predator, storm, or displacement. To say this is not to romanticize trauma. It is to admit continuity. Consider how deeply fire still occupies the imagination. Even in technologically advanced societies, people gather around flame for reasons that exceed utility. A candle, a hearth, a campfire, even the visual imitation of fire in winter spaces, all of it draws the eye, slows speech, softens vigilance without entirely dissolving it. Fire is warmth, yes, but it is also bounded safety. It creates an inside against an outside. That spatial emotion may be far older than architecture. For Ice Age humans, the fire circle was one of the first reliable centres in an unreliable world. Around it, food became digestible, tools could be repaired, stories could pass, and darkness could be held back by something alive and visible. The emotional residue of that arrangement may never have fully left. The same may be true of enclosure. Caves, shelters, covered sleeping places, walls against wind, thick fabric against exposed air. These are practical solutions, but they are also emotional technologies. A body resting in shelter is not only protected, it is permitted to lower its alertness. That permission matters. In severe climates, exposure was not merely unpleasant. It threatened heat loss, visibility, and safety. To be enclosed was to recover the margin in which thought could turn away from immediate threat. Even now, the language of comfort often borrows from burial and hiding, tucked in, wrapped up, cocooned, covered, nestled. These are not urban metaphors. They belong to older negotiations between body and world. Then there is the matter of movement. Modern people often experience migration as rupture, whether through travel, exile, displacement, or even the smaller restlessness of contemporary life. Yet the species itself was shaped by repeated movement through unstable ecologies. The first Ice Age humans did not inhabit permanence as a default state. They inherited routes, windows, corridors, and return patterns that could fail. Perhaps that is why modern humans remain so psychologically divided about movement. One part of the mind still responds to departure as danger, another as necessity, another as possibility. To leave and to remain are both charged far beyond logic. Deep time may be one reason why. There is also the strange endurance of apocalyptic imagination. Long after most people ceased living under glacial uncertainty, cultures continue to generate visions of flood, winter, darkness, fire from the sky, collapsing order, and worlds remade. Religion, politics, and technology each gave these fears new forms, but the emotional structure remained hauntingly old. Stability is never entirely trusted. Civilization may praise permanence, yet human beings remain susceptible to the feeling that everything established can be overturned by forces larger than themselves. Perhaps this is simply rational, given history. But perhaps it is also older than recorded history, an inheritance from ancestors who learned repeatedly that the environment can betray continuity without warning. The body itself sometimes seems to remember what the conscious mind has forgotten. Seasonal depression, sensitivity to light cycles, sleep changes in winter, cravings for warmth and calorie-dense food, vigilance in darkness, attraction to rhythmic repetition during stress, all can be explained through physiology without invoking poetic ancestry. But physiology is the bridge here. It is not separate from deep history. Bodies are records too, though written in tendencies rather than words. They do not tell stories clearly, but they preserve pressures. A species that survived glacial cold, recurrent scarcity, and unstable seasons was unlikely to emerge psychologically untouched. This may also help explain humanity's peculiar relationship to memory and interiority. The Ice Age may have selected not only for cooperation and planning, but for the ability to rehearse absence, to think ahead toward what was not present, to store emotionally for scarcity, to imagine loss before it arrived. Such habits are useful in dangerous environments. They are less comfortable in peaceful ones. Anticipatory thought can become anxiety when it outlasts the conditions that sharpened it. Hyper-awareness becomes vigilance. Vigilance becomes difficulty resting. One wonders how much of the modern mind's inability to feel fully secure is not purely pathological, but partly ancestral, an old skill wandering in a world that changes too differently for the body to interpret with confidence. And yet the Ice Age legacy is not only fear. There is also resilience in it, though that word can become too clean if used carelessly. What endured through glacial hardship was not coldness of feeling, but the opposite. Care intensified, cooperation deepened, attention became more refined. Meaning gathered around repeated acts, beauty survived in caves, in ornament, in rhythm, in burial, in the patient shaping of tools beyond crude necessity. If the psychological inheritance of deep cold includes apprehension, it may also include tenderness sharpened by precarity. A species that learned how fragile life could be may also have learned how much gentleness mattered to keep it going. This dual inheritance, fear and care, vigilance and beauty, may still structure the human interior more than later civilizations admit. It appears in the fascination with ruins, in the comfort of ritual, in the reflex to store against uncertain futures, in the intimate power of storytelling at night, in the sense that dark weather changes thought, and in the strange peace many people feel when listening to low voices speak of ancient danger from a place of present safety. Perhaps the popularity of quiet historical storytelling itself touches something very old, the relief of hearing uncertainty shaped into narrative while remaining protected from the cold outside. If that is true, then the Ice Age lives on not merely as subject matter, but as atmosphere. It survives in the way people seek warmth against vastness, meaning against instability, repetition against panic, and community against exposure. The first humans may be gone beyond recovery, their coasts drowned, their symbols fractured, their direct testimony forever unavailable. Yet something of their emotional weather may remain active in every later generation. Not as a literal memory, not as a secret code hidden in the blood, but as disposition, a leaning of the species toward firelight, shelter, caution, and story whenever the world feels too large to trust. That possibility is difficult to prove, and perhaps impossible to measure fully. Still, it lingers because it feels proportionate to everything that has already been lost. If early humans were shaped by a world of deep, cold, abrupt transition, other human species, vanishing animals, drowned lands, and unstable signs, then one would expect some residue to remain where direct evidence cannot, in temperament, in imagination, in what calms and disturbs us without our quite knowing why. And once one begins to suspect that, another question follows with quiet force. If the Ice Age still shadows the modern mind at the level of instinct, then perhaps later civilizations did not simply inherit its aftermath. Perhaps they built their religions, their fears, their need for order, and even their vision of history itself upon a nervous system first disciplined by a world that kept ending and beginning without explanation. By now, the story has become difficult to hold in one shape. The Ice Age no longer appears as a simple age of snow through which humanity marched in a single line toward civilization. It has widened into something more fractured and more intimate, a world of moving coasts, unstable seasons, vanished animals, parallel humankinds, symbolic chambers, drowned roots, broken patterns, and memories that survived only by becoming strange. Each layer has made the past feel less empty and less secure at the same time. And perhaps that is the most honest place to arrive before the end, not at certainty, but at the threshold where several truths can stand beside one another without yet agreeing on how they fit. One truth says that the first humans experienced the Ice Age as an environmental reality of immense pressure, and nothing more supernatural is required. Climate shifted, ice advanced and retreated, populations adapted, moved, learned, and sometimes disappeared. This account is grounded, powerful, and supported by a vast body of evidence. It does not need hidden civilizations, cosmic punishments, or forbidden archives to explain why life was hard and continuity fragile. The Earth itself is enough. Its cycles, its thresholds, its indifference, its capacity to rearrange the conditions of existence across generations. These already provide more than enough force to shape the species profoundly. Another truth stands beside it, quieter and more troubling. The record is incomplete in ways that are not accidental. This is not a dramatic claim. It is nearly unavoidable. Sea levels rose, coastlines drowned, organic materials decayed, entire domains of human life unfolded in media and locations poorly suited to preservation. If what survives are mostly caves, bones, stone, and scattered camps on present land, then what is missing may not be peripheral. It may include some of the most emotionally and economically important places Ice Age people ever knew. The absence of evidence in such cases cannot be treated as clean evidence of absence. It marks a boundary of visibility, not a final verdict. A third truth unsettles the first two by complicating who the humans even were. The glacial world was not inhabited by modern Homo sapiens alone. Neanderthals and perhaps other now lost populations belong to that reality as well. That means the Ice Age was not merely the early trial of one humanity, but a meeting ground of multiple human forms, each with its own knowledge, vulnerabilities, and ways of enduring. Some of those lines were absorbed, some vanished, none left writing. The surviving lineage inherited the earth, but inheritance can easily disguise how many voices were silenced before the story narrowed into one. Then there is the matter of meaning. A fourth truth emerges there, less measurable but not easily dismissed. The first humans did not simply survive the Ice Age materially. They appeared to respond symbolically as well. They painted animals in darkness. They marked walls with hands. They buried their dead. They likely tracked patterns, transmitted subtle knowledge, and developed emotional structures adequate to a world that kept altering its terms. Whether one calls that ritual, proto-religion, social memory, or something without a modern name matters less than the larger recognition. The glacial world did not produce only techniques. It helped produce inwardness. A severe planet asked not only for adaptation, but for interpretation. And once interpretation enters, the boundaries between event and memory begin to blur. Later myths of flood, darkness, former ages, and catastrophic transition may not be literal recollections of one Ice Age episode, yet they preserve the enduring human suspicion that the world is capable of deep rupture. That suspicion feels older than writing because it likely is. It may come partly from glacial inheritance, partly from the repeated shocks of the late Pleistocene, partly from the long afterlife of drowned places and broken routes. The result is not a hidden code waiting to be solved. It is more elusive, a continuity of mood. a shared architecture of loss. But if all these truths stand together, what do they imply? Perhaps something both modest and immense. Perhaps the first Ice Age humans experienced neither a neat beginning of history nor a fully comprehensible natural disaster, but a prolonged encounter with instability so foundational that later civilizations could never remember it cleanly. The earliest chapter of the human story may already have been shaped like aftermath. Not aftermath in the sensational sense of a lost global empire brought down overnight, but aftermath as a condition of living after environments had shifted, after roots had failed, after one rhythm of the earth had yielded to another. Humanity may have become recognizably human not in a stable origin, but in repeated negotiation with endings. That possibility changes the emotional center of the entire narrative. It means the first Ice Age humans were not simply early in the sense modern people often imagine. They may already have been old in experience, burdened with inherited uncertainties and local losses no one could fully contextualize. A child born into a community adapting to rising water or a changed migration corridor would not experience that condition as novelty. It would feel normal, even if the elders carried a different map in memory. In this sense, deep prehistory may already have contained generations living among echoes of a world they had not seen. That is a disturbingly modern feeling, and perhaps that is why so many later frameworks struggle to accommodate the Ice Age honestly. The standard historical instinct is to search for stable beginnings. Agriculture begins here, civilization here, writing here, statehood here. But the Ice Age insists on a more fractured origin. It suggests that before there were states to keep archives, there were already losses large enough to disturb memory. Before the first formal calendar, there may already have been broken seasonal expectations. Before the first scripture, there may already have been ritual responses to environmental betrayal. Before the first empire organized the past, the planet itself had already censored enormous parts of it. This does not prove that official history is false. It does something more subtle. It reveals that official history begins too late to witness the deepest shaping pressures of human consciousness directly. By the time the archive becomes reliable in the written sense, much of the formative drama has already passed into fragment, sediment, symbol, and instinct. The written record is therefore not the whole of history's memory. It is only the point at which memory learned to externalize itself more durably. What came before was no less real because it was less legible. It was merely more vulnerable to being mistaken for silence. So the question in the title, what really happened during the first Ice Age humans experienced, may resist final answer not because nothing happened, but because too much did. Cold advanced, yes, but so did symbolic life. Landscapes opened, then drowned. Other human species lived and vanished nearby. Animals structured consciousness. The sky may have become a guide. Knowledge passed through bodies rather than books. Then patterns broke. Seas rose. Memory frayed. Later civilizations inherited the ground left behind, and called their own beginning the beginning of the world they could understand. That may be necessary. But necessity is not completeness. To stand at this late point in the journey is to feel the outline of a hidden continent of human experience just beneath the surface of accepted history. Not a literal continent waiting to be found intact, but a continent of missing proportion. The surviving evidence is real, yet perhaps too thin in relation to the life that produced it. The myths are ambiguous, yet perhaps too persistent to ignore. The institutions of knowledge are invaluable, yet perhaps too shaped by their own need for order to hold all the fracture at once. The result is a past both recoverable and permanently damaged. And if it is permanently damaged, then perhaps honesty requires a final humility. The first humans did not enter history under stable light. They came into recognizability while the world itself was changing the rules, while memory struggled to hold place, while animals vanished, while coasts retreated, while kindred humans disappeared, while the signs in sky and season became both necessary and uncertain. Such a beginning is not a clean origin story. It is closer to a fog lifting over ruins no one has yet learned how to name, which leaves one last tension unresolved. If the earliest human world was already marked by rupture, loss, and incomplete inheritance, then perhaps what later ages called civilization was never purely a new creation. Perhaps it was also an attempt, partial, anxious, and unfinished, to rebuild order over a wound so old that even its first witnesses could not fully explain what had happened to them. In the end, the oldest human cold remains difficult to imagine because it does not belong fully to history or fully to myth. It stands between them like a dim shoreline at dusk, visible enough to know it is there, indistinct enough that every attempt to approach it changes its shape. The first humans who experienced the Ice Age did not leave behind a final explanation of what was happening to them. They left movements, marks, shelters, bones, pigments, roots, absences. They left enough to trouble certainty, enough to suggest that the beginning of the human story was never a calm awakening into progress, but something more unstable, a long listening inside a world that could not be trusted to remain itself. That may be why the subject lingers with such unusual force. It is not only about vanished glaciers or mammoths, or the technical questions of paleoclimate and migration. It is about the first sustained encounter between the human mind and planetary indifference on a scale large enough to distort memory. A storm can terrify. A winter can wound. But an age of changing cold, repeated instability, drowned coasts, disappearing animals, and broken continuity does something more profound. It teaches that the world is not arranged for human reassurance. It can become unrecognizable without malice, and remain so without apology. And yet the earliest humans did not simply vanish beneath that lesson. They answered it, though never in one language. They answered with fire circles and fitted hides, with careful routes and remembered crossings, with pigments in caves, with watchfulness toward animal movement, with burials that implied the dead could not be treated as mere residue, with marks that may have counted time, and with stories, spoken perhaps beside flame or under skin tents or within chambers of stone, whose words are gone but whose necessity can still be felt. To answer the world without mastering it may be one of the oldest human acts. It is quieter than conquest, more fragile too, but perhaps more defining. What really happened then during the first Ice Age humans experienced? One answer is simple and severe. They endured a changing climate powerful enough to shape their bodies, movements, emotions, and forms of attention. They adapted because the alternative was extinction. They followed animals, learned cold, read sky, buried kin, painted fear and reverence onto walls, encountered other humankinds, and crossed lands that later sank beneath water. They survived within fracture. That alone is immense enough. But another answer follows behind it, less easy to prove and perhaps more difficult to set aside. Something was lost in that long encounter, which later history could never fully retrieve. Not only places, though many places were drowned. Not only species, though many species vanished. Not only populations, though some entire human lineages faded into bone and diluted inheritance. Something in the proportions of the story itself was lost. The surviving archive is real, but thin. The later myths are transformed, but resonant. The official histories are careful, but late. Each preserves a face of the past. None contains the whole body. This is the quiet wound beneath prehistory. Humanity may have been shaped decisively by experiences it can no longer remember directly. The species may have learned caution, cooperation, ritual attention, pattern reading, and emotional strategies for surviving instability under conditions too old, too submerged, and too poorly preserved for later civilization to name with confidence. If so, then modern humans are in a strange position. They live inside inheritances whose first formation lies beyond the threshold of explicit memory. They explain themselves with recent categories while carrying much older weather in the nervous system. Perhaps that is why the story of ice so easily becomes philosophical. It refuses to remain only scientific, though science is indispensable to it. It refuses to remain only symbolic, though symbolism gathers around it naturally. It presses instead toward a deeper uncertainty. How much of what human beings call culture began as an answer to danger? How much of religion began as an effort to speak to a world that had broken continuity? How much of history began not when writing appeared, but when human groups first realized that the earth could shift beneath inherited knowledge and force memory itself to change shape? These questions cannot be settled fully. But once asked, they are difficult to silence again. There is also a darker consolation here. The first humans were not granted clarity. They had no chart of glacial cycles, no formal map of sea level rise, no theory of abrupt climate oscillation, no taxonomy for the other humans sharing their world, no archive secure enough to preserve what they feared losing. Still they looked, tracked, noticed, adjusted, and made meaning. They inhabited uncertainty without the comfort of final explanation. In this, they are less distant from the present than they first appear. Modern people possess more information, but not necessarily more immunity to instability. They too live with changing climates, fraying certainties, institutional stories that may prove partial, and a lingering suspicion that the world beneath accepted narratives is larger and less controlled than it seems. So the Ice Age becomes more than a vanished epoch. It becomes a mirror held at an angle. In it can be seen a species learning, very early, that survival is not only material, it is interpretive. One must decide what to trust when patterns fail. One must carry memory even when memory has holes. One must build forms of order, knowing they may one day be broken. The first humans did this without monuments that lasted, without texts, without guarantee that anyone would later understand them. Their response survives mostly as trace, which may be fitting. A trace is not an answer. It is a sign that something passed this way and mattered enough to alter the ground. And perhaps that is the most honest conclusion available. The first Ice Age humans did not witness the beginning of history in any triumphant or singular sense. They may instead have lived through one of the earliest great conversations between humanity and loss. Cold stripped certainty away, rising seas repossessed familiar worlds, animals that once structured existence disappeared. Other human beings stood nearby and then fell silent. Knowledge had to be carried through bodies, symbols, and repeated acts because nothing else could hold it for long. Out of that pressure came not a finished civilization, but the conditions from which civilizations later tried to protect themselves: memory, ritual, caution, timing, belonging, and the need to believe that chaos could be shaped into story. Yet story never fully heals the break. It only teaches the break to speak softly. That may be why these ancient questions still feel so near. Beneath modern architecture and electric light, beneath scholarship and myth, beneath the smooth confidence of maps, the old uncertainty remains. Somewhere under the sea are coastlines no living person has seen. Somewhere in caves are marks whose full meaning no one can recover. Somewhere in the body are reflexes trained by winters that ended before language could preserve them properly. The human world rests above missing rooms, and so the image that remains is not of conquest, but of embers. A small circle of warmth in a vast dark. Faces lit and then withdrawn. Breath visible in cold air. Beyond the light, animals moving, ice shifting, water waiting, stars repeating their patient distances. No final witness steps forward to explain it. No complete archive rises from the drowned edge of the world. There is only this enduring impression, that humanity began to know itself while listening to forces larger than memory, and that everything built since then may still be, in some quiet way, an attempt to keep that first fire alive against a night that never fully disappeared.